All right. So hi everybody. I'm Rand Hoppy. I'm the collections manager at the Hoboken Historical Museum, and we've got a small crew here. We've got half a baseball team from representing the traffic signal mafia. That's what it says on the shirt, right? But
watch out.
Yeah, and we've got some people in the audience, so we're kind of doing a hybrid event. Hello, everybody. Since we are streaming live, you are welcome to ask questions. I'll be behind the camera in a minute, and I'll be raising my hand and passing questions along. But right now, we've got Chris, right? And Chris is gonna fire up a presentation, and off we go.
All right. Well, I want to thank the folks from the Hoboken Historical Museum for inviting us to come up here today, and I also want to acknowledge and thank my three fellow Signal Mafia members, Mike Natale, Randy Trezak, and Francis Curry, all of whom are very dear friends of mine, and we are here to talk about a very unique, somewhat obscure hobby that we all share, which is a love and a fascination with and an interest in historic traffic signals. And that is actually how we ended up getting this project underway. So we're here to talk about one traffic light in particular, which was hanging for 82 years at the corner of First and Washington Street in Hoboken. I first saw the signal back when I was visiting one of our audience members, Josh Axelrod, who I went to Franklin and Marshall College with. Back in 2001, it was before 9/11, I come up to visit Josh in Hoboken. He's been a long-time Hoboken resident, loved the city, just an amazing, wonderful city. And you know, we're here as part of a wonderful exhibit on the history of Washington Street. So if anyone out there has never been to this museum, please come and see it. It's a terrific place. I'm a museum person too. I'm actually the executive vice president of the Baltimore Streetcar Museum. I'm from Maryland. I drove all the way up from Maryland just to talk about an old traffic light to show you how crazy I am about this stuff. But it's going to be a fun talk, and we put a PowerPoint together. Several of us are going to be passing along some cool information, but I saw that old traffic signal at First and Washington, and I think Josh was laughing at me because I just stared at it for like 10 minutes. I was standing in the intersection looking up at it like, that thing is ancient. How is that thing still hanging there? This was in 2001. So anyway, and just by way of introduction, I'm going to just kind of go through the slides here. We are traffic signal historians, and we look at it in a bigger context. Most of us also love history. We love the history of cities. We love bridges. We love old signage, neon lights, roads, drawbridges, you name it, we like it. But for us, our passion is traffic signals, and most of us actually have our own collection of stoplights that we keep in our garages, our basements, etc. And a lot of people have asked me, well, where did this fascination with signals come from? Well, I'm actually going to share with you just a short clip. I grew up in the 70s with Sesame Street, and I can literally relate back the moment that I started to love these wonderful, unassuming objects that are literally hidden in plain sight that you hope people actually pay attention to, although not always. So I'm going to show you a little clip. This is from 1971 from the great children's television show, Sesame Street.
You know what that is? Sure, that's a traffic light. It tells the cars when to stop and go. And it tells people when it's okay to cross the street. The light on the top is red. That means stop. When the light is red, everybody has to stop. The light on the top means stop. The light on the top means stop. That's the red light. How about the light on the bottom? The light on the bottom means go. That's the green light. Green means go. The light on the bottom means go.
pretty lucky we have traffic lights. You know what would happen if we didn't have traffic lights?
What?
This.
I'm glad we have traffic lights.
What a great piece.
There it is. So, we're here to talk about, of all the traffic lights in the world, one very special signal that is a relic of Hoboken, New Jersey, and it is a survivor. And somehow it evaded being taken down or modified or upgraded by the city of Hoboken for 82 years. And I'm going to turn the presentation over to my good friend Francis, who has a terrific website, gardenstatesignals.net, where he goes into a history of pretty much the entire traffic signal world of New Jersey, where he is from. I'm from Maryland, but I have a very special fondness for New Jersey. My wife grew up in West Orange. Hi, Katie. I know she's watching.
She just commented, by the way.
Oh, that's great. That's great. She said, my husband is the biggest nerd. That's right. So I'm going to invite Francis to come up. Francis and I have been friends since 2003. We have gone signal hunting through the wilds of northern New Jersey for years. And Francis is...
got killed doing it.
One time, but they didn't catch us. I got the picture.
Yeah.
So Francis is going to tell us about the Horny Signal Manufacturing Company, which actually made the signal that's here at the museum. So Francis, take it away.
Well, and another amazing thing is it never got knocked down in all those years. But yeah, and liking old traffic lights is something I guess like anything you don't decide to do. But in my case, I think that decision was made for me as my brain was forming. And I remember seeing this light for the first time with one of my other loves, which is old guitars. There used to be Outlaw Guitars on First Street. There was Hoboken Vintage.
Mm-hmm.
I was there one day and I could see the light from a block and a half away. And I said, I'm going to go look at some guitars now, but that duly noted. I'm going to come back to that someday. So this was the light, and yeah, it turns out it's made by Horny Signal Manufacturing, founded in 1924, and they went till 1947. More on that later. Why only 1947?
Was that a band's name?
Yes, Horni is, I don't know, some Eastern European lineage, I guess.
Probably a modification of the Eastern European name.
Yeah, Paul and Joseph Horny. So one reason I'm talking on this section is because I found some information from my website that you're looking at now on the slide. So some of these old lights, this one here has 6-inch lenses, which is smaller than the light we have in the museum. A little older, this is from the mid-20s, the Type 250. Another one, a more ornamental option a city could have for certain corners with these Type 950s they're not quite circular lenses. And on the two pictures on the right are stolen from an eBay auction I found. I didn't bid on the light, I don't remember what it went for, but one of those survived. And another type is the 491, which they might all look the same to you, but these are another old-time mid-20s style, typically in the middle of an intersection at an island, so-called, where they'd be installed on a pedestal. And here's actually one of those in Hoboken. So this picture is taken at 14th and Washington. That would have been erected in the 20s. I don't know when the photo dates from, probably about that time. So yeah, Horny Signal was making and distributing traffic lights in this area where there were a lot of cars early on already. And just running through this, here's a bunch of catalog material from late 20s, early 30s. We're getting closer now to the signal from our museum. And these signals are much closer to it. They're more standardized. They're 8-inch lenses. They're getting closer to what we're used to in the world as knowing as traffic lights, and they're aluminum cast. On the right here are some ads. Horny was distributing signals in Europe. Those are ads from Spain. Here is, you'll see the word Rouletta because that's kind of a related company that produced traffic signals, and they took some of the old Horny models and created lights under their name. But basically, if you look at these are Horny style lights under the name Rouletta. On the left being a light that I have in my basement, on the right being one of those classic guys in New York City. Any of you my age or older may remember seeing these two-color red and green lights in New York City a lot, if that caught your notice like it did to me. And some more ads here from the late 20s, both Rouletta and Marbolite and Horny Signal. This is one of those mysteries that we who are interested in this stuff and collect these things have been trying to decipher for years, looking through old ads like who owned these, when, and what brand are they, etc. So Horny, Marbolite, and Rouletta are names that we throw around a lot as collectors. Moving on. Okay, so here's the light that is the star of the show today. This is a sectional. The sectional Horny from First in Washington, and like Chris said, it was there for 81, 82 years before it came down. I can't believe it was never even knocked down. So, and this picture in the middle was taken by Kevin Mueller, who's a good friend of Chris's in Maryland, right? And looking up, so you can get that view right now if you all come down to the museum. Just don't have the blue sky and the mast arm above it anymore. But it's a lovely scallop bodied shape to it. It's an eye-catching light. It's a very old, pretty-looking thing. It's cool. That's why we're here. And you can't find them anywhere. And just to round out a little bit more of the Horny, then in the late 40s, actually late 30s, they started making what really look more like traffic lights we're used to. They changed the design a bit more there. I call it closed sectional signals. It's just they were easier to put together, and what's the word I want to use, like Legos, you just want to pull them apart and configure them any way you want. It's easier to do that. And let me finish my bit here with, here's a publication now, Horny Signal. They made a lot of stuff for the World War II. In that era, they did a lot of things for the Army. They produced communication equipment, and I'm not quite sure of all the products they made, but they had big contracts with, I guess, the Army, tools, all sorts of stuff. So some very nice patriotic language here in a publication that Horny put out in 1943, where Paul Horny says, we must ask ourselves if we as soldiers on the production front are giving the, quote, last full measure of devotion, unquote. It's clear that for us, the line of duty is to reach out beyond ourselves in the performance of whatever task is assigned to us. As production soldiers, our duty is to make more, to give more, to toil more. I'll stop there, but it's interesting to see where this language came from and where things went from there. But I'll turn it back over to Chris. All right. Thanks.
Well, as bad luck would have it for the Horny brothers, for all their patriotism, they did make a lot of money. They actually made over $17 million in war work during the 1940s, but they never paid a dividend. And it turns out in 1947, they all got indicted. And I do have to say that the quality of newspaper reporting in the 1940s is unlike anything that we have today. I mean, they deep dove into every little detail about the Horny brothers literally milking this traffic signal company for every penny. And one of my favorite quotes is Joseph Horny, who was the plant foreman at the Newark, New Jersey plant. This sounds like something out of like a 1920s gangster movie, like, you know, Charles Horny, the nebulous figure at the Newark plant in New Jersey, was arrested, and they had $7,500 cash bail. So they were not only accused of theft, but apparently Paul Horny had a little bit of a gambling problem. So a receiver had been appointed for the company, and they started investigating their finances. Well, it turns out that Paul had written a company check for $6,100 to pay off a gentleman in a poker game where he lost the hand and had to pay up, and he wrote a personal check to this mining wealthy magnate from Montana, and the guy said, your check's not good enough for me. I want a different check. So Paul Horny grabs the company checkbook and writes him a check for $6,100 to pay off his gambling debt. This is straight from the company. So part of the profits from that traffic signal back there may well have helped to pay this poor guy's gambling problem, and he wrote it off as engineering expenses. So I was actually reading that article just laughing hysterically. Now, the company was sold, and it was sold to a company called Marbolite, and if anyone traveled the streets of New York City from about 1957 until well into the 1990s, chances are virtually every other signal head at an intersection that you passed under was made by Marbolite. I actually have a Marbolite controller that runs about the 15 traffic lights that I have in my garage. And so Horny probably made out. I don't know whatever happened to the Horny brothers. We know Paul was living at the Ambassador Hotel in Newark. He didn't even have a fixed address, so who knows. So I want to sort of shift over to the First and Washington signal because we really want to keep this, Hoboken centered as much as we can. So let's talk about what the world was like in 1936. I really want to put a context to the installation of this really magnificent old signal. So, of course, it's hanging above the Sinatra Lounge, and I love sitting there listening to Old Blue Eyes, watching the light change, and it just, for me, it brings me great joy. But Frank Sinatra had just started singing with one of his first musical groups, the Hoboken Four, was performing at the Caspian Elks. He also had a car, which was very unusual back then, so I like to picture Frank Sinatra driving down Washington Street with his cigarette hanging out of his mouth and his characteristic rough demeanor, coming to that red light, probably cursing because he had to wait 30 seconds for the light to change green. That light would have been there as Frank Sinatra was starting his career. And I want you to think about, too, in northern New Jersey, the context of this light, now it was the Great Depression, but the explosion of infrastructure that was automobile-based was just unlike anywhere in the country. I mean, the Pulaski Skyway, which I passed under on my way here, which I still think is one of the most magnificent pieces of road infrastructure in the whole country, had just opened 4 years before that light was installed. The George Washington Bridge had just opened to traffic 5 years before, in 1931. The Lincoln Tunnel hadn't even opened yet. It was just about done. And, of course, the nearby Holland Tunnel, just south of us, was about 9 years old, opening up in 1927. We were still having 16% unemployment. Jesse Owens, a very famous Olympian and African-American, went over to Hitler's Germany and humiliated the Germans in the 1936 Olympics. He won 4 gold medals. And General Motors had cornered nearly 50% of the automobile market in 1936. They sold 43% of all the new cars in the United States. And I like to focus on northern New Jersey because this was, even in those days, even notwithstanding the Depression, was a booming, growing, thriving megapolis of towns that stretched, from as far south as New Brunswick and as frankly as far north as almost the New York state line. People needed to get around. They were driving cars. Even public transit in the 1930s, the streetcar system run by public service, and I'm very fond of streetcars, was starting to go the way of buses, trackless trolleys, and automobiles. So, here's some cool old pictures. I love this picture of the Holland Tunnel in the 1950s. And actually, that traffic light up there is a Kraus-Heinz. I have one of those in my collection. It's a beautiful light. Here's the Lincoln Tunnel opening in 1937. I mean, these were massive public infrastructure investment projects. The George Washington Bridge, another just, phenomenal feat of engineering, truly one of the great wonders of the world. And I love this picture. This is Route 1. Now remember, before the interstate highway system, if you wanted to travel from, let's say, Hoboken to Baltimore, where I live, you would have gone on Route 1, and this is what it looks like in the 1930s. And by the way, that traffic light hanging out there is a Horny 4 cluster that is very similar to the one in Everything. That's actually one of the reasons I love this picture. But, the traffic control technology was in its infancy at this time. There were no turn signals. There was no don't walk signals. It was just clusters of red, yellow, green stoplights, in many ways hanging over the middle of the intersection. These people were lucky. There was actually 2 of them. They were only 8 inches, and of course, in more recent years, federal standards changed all of that. So let's talk about the Hoboken Horny through the years. And thank goodness we have an amazing photographic history of the journey of this light. And I do say journey because, you know, if you're an old car collector and you find an old car in a barn, you refer to it as a survivor. It's an all-original survivor. And this traffic light, when we saw it, the first thing I noticed is that it had not been converted to LED. Many traffic signals, a lot of older ones, had been upgraded as early as the late 1990s with LED technology, but they would keep the original aluminum metal housings. This one still had its original incandescent bulbs. And so I thought that was kind of cool. The other thing about this light is it was the only one at that intersection. Nowadays, you come up to an intersection, there's 4 of them up here, there's one over here, they got one hanging back here. I mean, you'll definitely see it, but when you approached this intersection, that was all you saw. And Washington Street's a pretty wide street, so you really had to look for this light. It was not easy to see, and if you go stand under the light, you can see that they adjusted it and angled it for certain directions so that you could see it. And now what's interesting is even back in 1936, First Street was a one-way street heading east. That's right. So there was a signal head facing backwards. That was for the pedestrians, but you almost had to walk in the middle of the intersection just to look up and see is the light red or green. So you kind of, I'm Catholic, you say Hail Mary and just go and hope that when it changes to yellow to red, you got enough time to get across. So of course, here's a map of where the light was, and I do love sort of the fact that the streetscape really didn't change much at all in the 82 years that it was there. And of course, the picture on the right, which was taken by Kevin Muller, who I will say on a special note, officiated my wedding. He is a man of the cloth and a traffic signal fanatic. Hi, Kevin, I hope you're watching. And he has a collection that is just phenomenal. But if you can see that the streetscape really didn't change that much. So this, and what else is absolutely incredible about this light is it's hanging on the same hardware from 1936. It's what's called a double guide wire signal, and you can see there's two strong, sturdy. They're more like steel rods that are connected to the end of the pole that basically keep the light supported and they keep it from bending in the wind. This thing has been through hurricanes, it's been through blizzards, it's been through blistering hot summers, cold winters, and being a transit fanatic, I couldn't help but also point out that Washington Street at the time had an electric trackless trolley bus line running down it, and the pictures are a little washed out, you know, the quality of the pictures from the old days, but you can see the hardware for the double wires above the street, which I think is kind of cool. And they're actually, it's funny, I saw a bunch of pictures here. If I had seen them, I would have dumped them into this presentation. We would be here for 2 hours. But we did show some of the history of the light over the years, and it shows up in a lot of pictures. Fast forward to 1988, it's still there. Actually, at one time, it was painted silver. There was a lot of northern New Jersey traffic signals were painted silver, and you can see it. It went through a couple of different paint jobs. When I first really took an interest in the signal, I started coming up to see it starting, as I mentioned, in the year 2001. It was July of 2001. I'd come up to ride the old Redbird subway cars in New York before they were retired, and then I went over to Newark to ride the city subway PCCs. My museum actually has one of the old Newark PCCs. We're restoring it right now. Cool. And then I came to see my friend Josh, and we went out to dinner. He was living on Washington Street at the time, and then we came to that intersection. I stood there. And I didn't know who made it. I didn't know as much about signals really until I met Francis a couple of years later. But then we started coming up and documenting the history of this light. And we would come up and take pictures of it and keep an eye on it. And we were just in awe that it was still there. Again, that this is what it looked like from the approach. There wasn't a second cluster on the left-hand side. That was it. And actually, at every intersection on Washington Street, they all were hung like that. And I have to say, on a personal note, you know, my grandparents retired to Cape May, New Jersey, and I remember vividly as a kid going down to the boardwalk, and along the boardwalk, they had little clusters of stoplights at all the intersections that look just like this. So, you know, every time I see a street that looks like that, it just brings me back to like my childhood. You know, I grew up in the 70s, and there's still a lot of old signal technology that was out there. And here's another shot. You know, look, you don't see too many pictures of it looking south from this angle, which is kind of neat. And you can see the other one down the street is a newer head, but same deal. It's just one single light hanging out, maybe a couple of feet into the intersection, and from certain angles, these were not easy to see. And then we got word that the city of Hoboken was going to do a massive street upgrade of Washington Street. And of course, my first thought was, oh no, this light's finally going to get taken down, and what's going to happen to it? And I was in a panic, because I knew one of two things was going to happen to this light. It was going to end up in a dumpster, or it was going to end up in some signal collector's basement, never to be seen again. And I thought to myself, this traffic light is a part of Hoboken's history. It is a part of the streetscape of Washington Street. It needs to stay here in this town. It needs to be preserved. And so I actually called the mayor's office, out of the blue. I'm in Baltimore. I called the Hoboken mayor's office, like, I want to speak to the mayor. And they're like, who the heck are you? And I'm like, I'm a traffic light nut. And I want to tell you all about this cool old signal up at First and Washington, click. So I called him back, and finally I got somebody that didn't think I was literally crazy on the phone. And I said, just do me a favor. Go out to that intersection and take a look at that light and ask yourself, have you ever seen anything like that? Any other place you've been? And you know what? He went out, he looked at it, he called me and said, you know what? That thing is pretty unusual looking. And I said, it is an 82-year-old Horny manufactured traffic light that needs to be preserved by this city. You cannot let anything happen to it. And so cue that up. He said, I'm going to get you in touch with a guy named Robert Foster, who happens to be the head of the Hoboken Historical Museum. And Bob and I started communicating probably around 2016 or 17, I want to say. It took them a while to take the light down. They made plans to upgrade Washington Street well over a year before we pulled the signal down. And so this is actually a picture of the day it came down. You can see it sitting on the ground over there. And you can see the new lights going up, and they're much bigger, they're newer, they have countdown pedestrian don't walk signals. The technology on them is great, but nothing like the old one. This is what it looks like today. Yes, they're much more visible. Personally, I think they're a little too big for the streetscape, because now they're using what are called 12-inch lenses. They're all LED, but they have actuators, so when you pull up, the light will change. You don't have to wait for it to cycle through. But none of the charm and beauty of the old light. So I wanted to talk next about just the process of how we got this thing into the museum. I mean, that light weighs, what would you say, about 250 pounds, would you say?
Yeah, conservatively. Yeah.
Maybe 300 pounds. So it's a beast. In fact, one of the things that is kind of amazing is for about 5 months between the day it was taken down and the day we hung it, which was in October of 2018, almost 3 years to the date, it sat in the municipal parking garage right across the street. Nobody bothered it, probably because it was too heavy to even pick up by any human being. It just sat in an alcove up on like the 5th floor of the garage, I want to say. It was way out of the way. It was the only place Bob had to store it, because he couldn't just bring it here and stick it on the floor. He wouldn't have been able to walk. So we all came up on October 20th of 2018. Bob got a lift, and we had one day to rewire, put a new controller in, raise it up, hook it to the top, and actually my friend Randy has experience. He's worked for the telephone company for many years. He used to install telephone cables, so he knew how to mount it to the top. And actually, this building we're in is a very old warehouse that has I-beams with large bolts that literally run through the support beams for the ceiling. So we were able to tie this in directly into the overhead beam. And so Randy did that. I'm going to show you some cool pictures. So, but we had one day to do this. All of us are from, I'm from out of state. Randy's from Long Island. Mike, where are you living? You're up in New York as well. Francis is the only one who's kind of close. He's over in Somerset, which is still like a good 45 minutes from here. So we had one day to do all this stuff. So here's some kind of fun pictures of us coming up to see the light. And of course, when we saw it, the thing is massive. When you see a traffic light up close compared to what it's like hanging up, outside on the street, they look nothing like they do when you're driving a car, obeying them when they're out in the wild. They're massive, pieces of infrastructure. One of the first things that was truly incredible was the wiring. Was all original 1936 era cloth wire, most of which had been completely stripped coming out of the top nozzle. And how this thing still even lit up without shorting itself out was, we couldn't believe it. So so the first thing we had to do was take all of the original wiring that went from the top that led to the terminal strip inside out. But the problem is we couldn't hand thread the wires through the pipework, so we had to tie off the new wire onto the old wire and pull it through. That way we could actually get it to thread, because we did not have the hardware to take all those 82-year-old pipes off. We never would have been able to do that. So we had to really think this thing through to make sure we didn't pull all the wires out and not be able to get the new ones through. So we did it. And it took us several hours to do. Now, we have a small digital controller that was made by a really cool guy up in Canada named Sean Green. So that is what is making the light sequencers, Francis, with his wires. And the other thing that I thought was cool is the bulbs that we pulled out of the signal was just a mishmash. I mean, there's one spotlight, one LED, there's a couple incandescents, one or two actually quite vintage that have sort of the fluted tops. And actually, the LED bulbs in the spotlight were terrible because they blocked out the light from behind the bulb, so the reflectors really didn't reflect much. So when you drive up to the light, it looks like just this moon in the middle of the lens, and the rest of it's dark, kind of spooky, and also not,
That spot was my favorite one. That big spot bulb.
Yeah.
And I remember, now that I took pictures on it right before it came down, I remember exactly seeing the spotlight behind the lens.
It's like the heat lamp.
Yes, exactly.
Put French fries on there.
It's probably the one that melted the red lens on that one
Pigeons
side.
love
Yeah, I'm sure it was warm in the winter.
And one of the funny things about the Horny Signal Manufacturing Company, aside from the name, go ahead and snicker. So we're going to say the word Horny a lot. It's okay. It's Paul and his nebulous brother at the Newark plant. They stamped the name on everything. I mean, they stamped it on the frame, on the hanger. And so this was sort of like our wonderful moment. We wired it up, and of course we had to test each socket. So we basically just hooked everything up just to make sure it would light up without throwing a breaker, and it did. So this was actually the first moment the signal had been under power of any kind for several months. And what's really cool about this light is, with one exception, it's got its original lenses, which have a very unique look to them. They're kind of beaded, and they really throw the light out in a way that they're very visible. It's almost like a lighthouse type lens. Like modern lenses are all LED backlit, so they're a little more simple and uniform. But this thing, they put a lot of effort into it. So now here's where Randy, the spelunker, gets up on the lift to do his thing. So he prepped the wire, he prepped the cables before we lifted it, and then we had to, the light wouldn't actually fit on the lift. We were hoping to put it in the middle of the lift, and it was too darn big. So what we did is we strapped it to the end, set a Hail Mary, and Randy hits the up button. And we're waiting for the thing to either fall off, or Randy to fall off, or the lift to tip over. And
I think the best part was that it's a 250-pound light, but I'm a 350 pounds. So I offset the tipping by being on the other end of the lift.
so all those cheeseburgers that Randy had eaten served us well.
That's your fault. You did this cheeseburger.
It was all part of the grand plan.
I was sweating bullets as this thing was going up, but Randy was a pro. I mean, and actually what he did is we hooked it up in stages. So he secured it to the cable when it was only a few feet off the ground. This was very smart. And then we would raise it a little bit more. You'd take up the slack, secure it again, make sure it would hang. And I will tell you, from a safety standpoint, we actually hooked an auxiliary chain to the light once it was at the top, tied it into a different beam rod. So that thing is not going anywhere. And actually, that's the way they hung them in New Jersey. If you drive up to it, when you leave here, the next time you stop at a red light, take a look at the connection hardware. You'll see a little chain, and that's actually a safety mechanism in case the clamp breaks. And actually, not a lot of states do that, but New Jersey does. So here's Randy up on the lift at the height of it. And of course, we finally got the light up. We hooked it up to the controller. It started cycling through its wonderful cycle. And then we cleaned it, we adjusted it, we wanted to angle it a certain way, and there it is. It was so much fun to do this project. It took us about 12 hours, I want to say.
It was a full day.
Francis and I had to run to the Home Depot down in Jersey City because we didn't have enough wire. I mean, we put a lot of work in. Mike Natale is an electrician, so he was really helpful in making sure that we safely could rewire the light. We've re-insulated all the original wiring. We wanted to make sure it was safe. And of course, Randy had the shirts made, which are the Signal Mafia shirts. So we hammed it up, for the day. So I thought what I'd do. We have about 20 minutes, and again, if anybody has questions, you can send it through. But Horny signals, and also just New Jersey lights in general, really in the context of just what a neat state this is. How many varied places are like Asbury Park. I mean, this is one of, if you might remember, Francis showed us a model of this in his presentation on the main, what Bruce Springsteen referred to as the circuit. This is right in front of the Paramount Theater, and you can see the Berkeley Hotel back behind this image. That's what the traffic lights in Asbury Park looked like in the 1930s. Horny actually made one of the first poly-plastic type signals during World War II when aluminum was in high demand. And there's one of them that actually one of our friends named David Prince found in Hackensack. It's still there. It's Bakelite. It's a plastic-like substance, and it's still out there. So,
wow.
It's still going strong.
You're probably looking after that one, right?
We still kind of keep an eye. This one disappeared, but Francis found this one a couple of years, back in 2003, I would say. And it's been gone for a while. But that, again, just to show you kind of what these look like. And they were all over New Jersey. We found this old photo from Bayonne. Jersey, every state had its own unique way of displaying, painting, and having their traffic signals shown to the driver. New Jersey's classic setup, and they have a lot of old postcards of towns from New Jersey, which I just love. I think this one is this Somerset, Francis? Somerville. So the New Jersey setup that I remember as a kid in Cape May was just like this. You have a very unique mast arm, and these are still very common in New Jersey to this day. This postcard's probably from the late 1960s, but in the old days, most of them were painted green or black. Yellow did not become as favored in the state probably until the 1980s. I remember even the late 70s, most of the lights were still green. They were a very whimsical way of hanging them. They typically would hang in clusters. They would try to limit how much damage they'd do to the sidewalk. If you can have one pole controlling 3 signals at once, that's better than putting 8 poles around, although today they'll just put the 8 poles around like they did on Washington Street. But this is kind of a neat, this is Newark, New Jersey in the 1960s. I think it's the corner of Springfield and Bloomfield Avenue in the Central Ward. Actually in the 50s, and these lights were probably brand new. And you can see, they're double guide wire. They have sort of a small mast arm. And, they weren't always the easiest things to see. They were 8-inch heads. They weren't the 12-inch style of today. We found a couple of neat shots of Hoboken, the old Fabian Theater.
All right.
You can see the picture on the right. Actually, Bob, I'm not sure exactly what street that is. Can you identify
14th Street.
14th
Looking
Street.
towards the river. That's a crane. That's 1 block from here.
The viaduct, right, where you go over the...
Yeah, that's at the foot of the viaduct, but we're looking east to New York City, and that's a crane from Bethlehem Steel Shipyard, which is where we're sitting right now.
Oh, okay. Great.
Which is cool. And this is Palisades Avenue. And this is, if you were driving on any, Hudson County town street in the 70s, this is what you would see. These are all 4-directional clusters, mostly still from the 1950s. In fact, way off in the distance, you can see an ancient 4-way that's painted yellow. But, you can see, these are Marble-Lake 4-ways, and I have one of these in my collection, and actually several of these guys probably do too. And I love the old transit bus, the old GM transit bus, which is signed for 14th Street in Hoboken, which is kind of cool. Union City in the 1930s, and I'm like a big transit nut, so I love streetcars. So any of the old streetcar pictures, you can always spot some of the antique traffic signals. I'm not even sure what brand that is. Do you guys have any idea what kind that is in the background?
So that's kind of like Union City, Bergen Line Avenue.
That's
and
Newark.
Oh, really? I'm sorry.
Yeah, oh, actually, and it's funny,
In the corners there.
yeah,
in the
actually,
corner.
in the lower corner, and I think I have a blown-up version of that one. Yeah, again, being a big Springsteen fan, I love Asbury Park. This traffic light is actually still there to this day.
Wow.
They painted it yellow, and it's right next to the old Palace entertainment complex, which, if you like the song Born to Run, when Springsteen sings Beyond the Palace, Hemi-powered drones stream down the boulevard, this was the palace that he was referring to in Asbury Park. And actually, this is the New York City subway, a lot of old traffic lights. And I couldn't tell, and I'm going to defer to Francis and Randy, are those GEs or are they... They're Hornies?
Yeah.
Okay, so actually, so this is South Orange Avenue, where the intersection of Route 280 crosses right behind this. It's not far from the Garden State Parkway interchange. This streetcar has to predate about 1954 because they upgraded to PCCs that same year. But there's always been a signalized crossing at this stop on the Newark City subway. And back in the early 1950s, that's what it looked like. Coming back to Washington Street, I mentioned that just about all the intersections had the single clusters. Again, very unassuming. And what was kind of neat is each intersection that had one alternated. So, you know, the first one would be on the right, and then you can see the one down on the left, and then they kind of went back and forth as you went down the street. And I don't know if they did that intentionally or not, but it kind of had kind of a cool look. I mean, that was your traffic light. There was no don't walk lights, there was no actuators, there was no countdown peds, there was no turn signals. It was just a 4-cluster stoplight, and when that thing turned red, you had to wait for the old electromechanical controller to cycle through its little dial that usually took about 45 seconds, and then it would turn green and you get to go. That's another angle. I think that's 5th and Washington. That's another light that we thought was cool. It was actually very early marble light. Francis, you said about 1947?
Yeah, that's very old.
Yeah, so there was a lot of old stuff. Actually, Union City had these what are called AGA signals. There's still one left, and they're from, what would you say, about 19...
20s, 30s?
Yeah, they're pretty old. So the Hoboken
Much
light
older
was
than the pole.
pretty old,
Yes.
but Union might have the older ones, but they LED'd them, and they put them on new poles. So ours is still more cool.
So where do you think this one is? Do you know?
That one's been taken down. That one was
Okay.
at the corner of Palisades.
There is still one AGA in service. We actually passed it on the way in.
Oh, cool.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, but-
Visiting your old friend.
yeah, absolutely.
And of course, you know, if we go out to Essex County near where my wife grew up, that's Bloomfield, and they had like 12-inch Econo lights. But we call these the trombone lights, where they were on these masts that were sideways. So a lot of the urban places of New Jersey had signals that were hung horizontally. And I always thought it was a cool look. In fact, Atlantic City, when I was a kid, you could look down Atlantic Avenue and see 30 of these things, and then all of them would change together, like just from one end to the other. It was just like a string of Christmas lights. And of course, in Montclair, they had the same type. This was a very common type of setup, especially in northern New Jersey, and mostly from the 1950s with Marble Light Heads, which was the successor company to Horny. West New York, for us signal geeks, is still the destination. They've left a substantial amount of their ancient stuff. We're talking like ancient, crazy stuff. And what's funny is cars will drive through these red lights because they cannot see them. We will stand on the intersections. Palisades Avenue is just a string of old stuff, and they, you know, again, we kind of watch this stuff. A lot of it is still there. Old 4-directional lights. I mean, most places in America, this stuff's been gone for 40 years. But you come up here to these towns that just hug the Hudson River, there's so much neat stuff there. Irvington in the 60s, they still have their old street lights. They had the long mast arm lazy signals that were mostly Marble Light. I love this one in Jersey City with the old GM bus. They were painted yellow. They had neon pedestrian don't walk signals. Actually, Francis had found for his website some really incredible old pictures of the state highways of New Jersey. Now, under federal standards, there is what's it called? The Manual of Uniform
Traffic Control Devices.
Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices has been the bane of signal collectors, because when they upgrade the standards for traffic lights, the first thing the municipalities do is take all the old stuff down. And we love the old stuff. So when the old stuff comes down, we cry, we whine. and then we try to find it for our basement. Or Randy, who actually is in the business of buying and selling traffic lights, can go out and actually sell them. But what I love about this view, this is a state road from New Jersey. These are 8-inch signals. So today, the federal government would never allow federal dollars to be used to install a setup like this because they want the larger 12-inch heads that are LED. So, but this is what, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when you were driving down Route 1 or Route 9 and you would come to one of those wonderful jug handle intersections that New Jersey is so famous for, this is what they looked like. And actually, again, for me, this is the Jersey I remember when I was a kid going to Cape May. Like, I remember stopping for intersections that looked just like this. And, again, they still had the double guide wire setups. They were sort of hanging them all over the place. I could never understand why they would hang a cluster over the opposite lane of traffic. Like, what's the point of that? But again, it's to give you a good visual as you're coming up on the intersection. This is another great one. I mean, this is turning yellow. These are old police photographs, by the way, taken from accident sites, so maybe they actually weren't all that safe. And of course, today, this is what you see. This is what they look like. And obviously, they're safer, they're more standardized, they're modernized, but do they have the soul of that First and Washington signal? I don't think so. And actually, this is one of the AGAs in West New York. I think Father Kevin took this one. I found a couple of these survivors on the, I think it's the JFK Boulevard that parallels the Garden State Parkway up in the East Orange, Newark area. As a kid, I used to love driving up the Garden State. I would have my nose pressed against the window looking for all these cool lights that had the crosses on. I'm like, oh, I love the ones with the crosses and the little wires. I was a weird kid. And of course, Park Avenue. Francis and I took a trip over to East Orange in 2003 just to document and take pictures of the streetscape, the old signals. Most of the stuff is all gone now. It's all been upgraded. Because again, towns get federal dollars. They like it. I was going to introduce Randy. He has a Facebook distribution site for buying old traffic signals. If anyone actually would like to add a signal to your basement, your garage, Randy will stay. You can private message us on Facebook. He's a great guy. I've gotten a lot of stuff from him.
Just as recently as today.
Absolutely. And Francis has a great website called Garden State Signals. Even if you're not a signal nut like us, just seeing the history of these cities told through the view through a windshield of just an average traffic signal is kind of cool. And actually, Francis has one of the greatest collectible signals. This is an old New York City two-sectional roulette, which is based on the Horny mold. So it's a very closely associated light. And didn't you just get that Passaic River sign, Francis? Yeah. It's cool. This is my collection. That's my garage. I don't have the neon sign lit because I literally don't have enough power in my garage to light everything up all at once. But my wife puts up with an awful lot with my collections. And so anyway, that is our presentation. And Randy, Mike, Francis, did you guys want to come up and add anything?
You did a very good job.
And
Great job.
I will quote it for interesting sources if this topic is of any interest to anybody aside from us. The traffic commissioner of New York City from 1962 to 1968 was a man named Henry Barnes. He invented something called the Barnes dance, which is where all the traffic lights would turn red, all the pedestrian walk lights would turn walk in 4 directions, and the pedestrians would rule the intersections for about 30 seconds. Baltimore had these at all the major intersections in our downtown shopping district, and they called it the Barnes dance. So Henry Barnes wrote a very funny, colorful autobiography that was published actually about a couple months before he died in 1968. He died of a heart attack on the job, and he was the New York City traffic commissioner. Him and Robert Moses detested each other. And he was sarcastic, cigar chomping, suffered fools not lightly, and wanted no one to get in his way of plowing through anything that got in the way of moving traffic. So the bike people that are putting all these bike lanes in, if Henry Barnes were alive today, he would be steamrolling every single bike lane back into a lane of traffic, because that's what he did. But I love his quote in the opening pages of his autobiography, and it says, If I see you at the next traffic light, for both of us, I hope it's green. Because while I have more than 70,000 of those red and green eyes in New York City alone, the green ones are the ones that I and millions of other drivers love the most. And I want to leave you with a scene from The Notebook. Yes, I've watched The Notebook, because there's a cool signal scene that I'm going to show you.
What are you doing?
Just come on.
You're gonna get run over.
By all the cars?
We've done this.
Lay down, watch the lights change. Watch them go from green to red to yellow.
You could have tried.
And the reason I wanted to show this scene is, one last thing importantly, that if you ever do get down to the museum to see the light, you might notice that when it changes from green to yellow to red, the yellow comes on at the same time as green, and you drive down the street, it's like, well, that's not how the traffic lights look. Well, actually, in 1936, most of the controllers had a green-yellow overlap that was very common well into the 1950s in some places. Baltimore City still had a few of those cycling like that well into the 1960s. So we wanted this signal to look and behave exactly like it did in 1936. So when Sean Breen designed the solid-state custom controller that's running it, which is only like the size of a small index card, we asked him to do the overlap green and red, and he did it. And if the light's going through it right now, and then it's got a little dark out phase, because the old controllers were basically a set of cams that would knock relays on and off, and sometimes the cams would get, we call them sloppy cams, where the cams would need to be oiled a little bit, so there would be this overlap between the signals. So anyway, I love this scene from The Notebook because it shows actually whoever made this movie had the right kind of traffic light with the right kind of sequence. And I can tell you, all of our friends, significant others can never watch movies with us because the one thing Hollywood screws up every single time, with almost few exceptions, is the traffic signals. You'll have you have a movie set in the 1950s, and then there's this 12-inch brand new Econo-Lite traffic light. I'm like,
No.
come on, people.
And you always know when something's shot in Canada.
Yes, the Canadian, the backlit yellow backplates. You ever see yellow backplates? It's not America, it's Canada. Although I will say there are a few notable exceptions. I'm a big fan of the movie A Bronx Tale, which was directed by Robert De Niro. He had all the signals on that block up in the Bronx replaced with green heads, just like they did in the 1950s and 60s New York. And I thought, somebody got it right. Hallelujah. Yeah.
Just to mention that at least in the province of Quebec, it's all barn dance. Every time you go, it's a barn dance.
That's cool.
Japan does that too. They
Yeah.
still hold that
Right.
barn dance.
And I remember one day, they're very strict on the traffic because they have like a stop sign, right? There was a taxi I was in, he stopped. It's the middle of the night, there's not a single car anywhere, and he's waiting for the traffic light to change. And because if he gets ticketed, he'll get like a $500 fine, you know.
It's wild. And by the way, I have to thank Randy who made us our swag. We actually have uniforms for today, our Three Signal Guys shirts with actually a picture of the Hoboken Horny on them. So France, actually guys come on up so you can see in the camera.
I'm going to turn you over.
This is the guy that made it all happen. He came today if it wasn't fair.
I just called the mayor. I bugged him until
Diligence is your middle name, I think. So, yeah, you got us here, and you made Project Horny what it was. We brought this light back to life, with Bob's help and Rand.
And we have to thank the Hoboken Historical Museum for giving it a home, for giving us a place that we can come back and see it. And now what's really incredible is it can be used as an educational piece to tell a little story of Washington Street, of Hoboken, and maybe folks will learn a little bit about traffic signals too. It's actually a really fun hobby. So.
You guys are amazing. I guess I just want to make a couple of comments. So I did the math. Frank Sinatra would have been 21 when he ran that traffic light. So it is possible. It is possible. The cameras didn't pick it up.
No.
But, right. And I remember when you guys came and installed, and as a museum director, I did what every good museum director would do. I said, you guys got it. You guys are going to handle this. I'm out of here. I wasn't even here that day, except in the beginning, because I had purchased tickets for my wife Holly, and they were scalp tickets, so they were like really expensive. And I knew when we were coordinating our dates, and that, your schedule is the most important because it was 4 of you or more, and we chose October 22nd, and that just is, like Friday. It's a 3-year anniversary of the traffic light. And I remember the dance. I guess it was Mayor Zimmer was in her second administration, and I remember the phone calls. I forget who we were dealing with. I think it was this guy named Dan, who's not there anymore. And he would call and go, should I be replying back to these guys? They seem really serious about this topic. And,
This guy.
and before that, I don't think I'd ever thought about a traffic light in my life. And there's a lot of ways to tell the history of a town, and why not from all the infrastructure, that's connected with the automobiles. And I remember thinking, should I be investing in this? And I kind of, since you weren't like in the neighborhood coming by, it would be like every few months we'd touch base, and you were pushing us. And I figured, if you guys are pushing us, and you're like in Maryland, the least we can do is, push this forward. And then I never knew if it would really happen. And then when they took the traffic light down, it actually came to the garage that's part of the shipyard here, because I didn't trust it down at the city garage.
Right.
So we found out which spaces aren't being used for cars, so we got them all, we brought them all, and we were able to send some your way too, which is great. But, getting it was just 40%. Getting it up here, installed, with no one getting hurt, was, 60%.
I mean, he wants to give credit. We all did it as a team.
You definitely did.
I couldn't have been up on that lift if I didn't have these guys down on the ground, getting this thing up and getting it strapped down tight, so that we could get it up there. We wouldn't have the light if it wasn't for you.
Right.
We wouldn't be here doing this presentation, Rand, and his technical skills.
Right.
It's what makes the museum a community museum.
Right, and I had never rented a lift before. I'm always trying to do things on the cheap, so every construction site I'm going, can we borrow your lift for 6 hours?
Why? I can't tell you.
Exactly. So eventually bit the bullet and went to United. This truck that came to deliver this, in a sense, a little lift, because it had to get through the front door, was like half a block long. It was meant for like all sorts of equipment.
Flatbed, yeah.
Exactly, and we had to, getting that thing so he didn't block traffic. It was pretty interesting. But I'm glad we did the
There it
lift.
is.
It was a great event.
Oh, that's right. That's
I
right.
think one of the scariest part was negotiating that lift through the door and making the right turn.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That thing was
And
just
ducking, yeah.
It was just the right size.
It
Everything was just the right
was the
size.
smallest one they
Didn't it
had.
come within like a fraction of an
I
inch
thought
of
we
the
were gonna
top
have
of
to
the
take the
door?
door off the hinges.
Yeah, no, it was all of that. And then, I believe, you were describing how we hooked it up there. There's a wood beam which was reinforced with steel plates, and then bolts had been gone through when they rehabbed the building. Simply took the nut off, pretty much, and just slipped it on top of that.
That was, by Providence, probably one of the best things that happened, because the type of hardware they used was very similar to the type of hardware we were able to purchase, and it's not stuff you come across every single day. It's not, you're not going to go to Home Depot per se.
No, this was,
use this in your house.
I had actually ordered special nuts, because I don't know, I thought we might need another one, and I remember going to McNair or McMaster and ordering the huge bolts, which I think we used what was up there.
We did. We used what was up there, and it worked out. You couldn't have asked. It was almost like it was supposed to be that way.
Right, and just think how you use the internet to just do all the things you do, to connect with each other, and to find these lights on the Google Maps. It's a great story of, using technology but respecting the old lights.
Google Maps has been excellent in that aspect, because with their regression feature at intersection, you can see what might have been there before and then you see the upgrade, so you
Right.
oh my God, it's gone.
And as I remember, that light, this light that was rescued, was actually up on a trolley pole.
It
That
was.
was the trolley.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
definitely a line pole that supported the overhead.
For the
What was-
trolley, the electrics.
Yeah, I mean, they must, I don't know the year that Washington Street was converted to an electric trackless bus. I'm reasonably sure it was a streetcar line at one point.
Right.
And what the cities would do is, because they wanted to protect their investment in the infrastructure, as they transitioned from streetcar to bus, they came up with the electric buses, which actually are zero emission. They're kind of cool. I didn't see any in any of the pictures, but
Right.
you can see the double wires up there.
Right.
That was
And,
definitely a line
and they
pole.
said getting that trolley pole out, it like went down really far, cast iron encased in a concrete column.
No,
And
it's
they just
funny.
said they ripped up the whole sidewalk getting it.
You would look at that trolley pole, there was a couple of times in recent years when I visited it, and you looked at that pole and you said, it hasn't got much more time left because
Yeah.
it was leaning
Right.
further and further to the street. Every time you come see it, like,
Right,
this is gonna
and
be
now
a-
every time I go under, like you watch the movie with the traffic light focus, whenever I drive through an intersection in an older town in a windy day, I just see this thing swagging back and forth. And I'm going, Holly, let's go, quick, quick, you know, because it's scary when you think how heavy.
Oh, yeah,
But
absolutely.
one of the things though, that the light did spend some time in the collection space. Because I remember it being you know, where we keep our archives. It was on a dolly.
That's right.
And it had and I just remember it had a honeycomb.
That's right.
Oh, right, a beehive.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yes, it did.
Well, you see those crazy light bulbs that were in there, it was probably pretty.
We were afraid someone was going to steal it. I don't know. And so
We
when you
were too.
Yeah.
biggest
You'd be
concern-
checking on it. Is it still there?
The big concern would have been that it could have wound up in scrap.
Right,
That would have been the
yeah,
first
sure.
thing that somebody
Right.
would have gone for unless it was traffic.
So if you're the traffic light mafia, are you like a particular family and that means there's other families out there?
This morning. We can't talk about the traffic light mafia. Don't want you to wind up in the river.
We can turn off. You're on
Kate,
plan.
this one time, I'll let you ask me about my
Anyway,
All right,
great project. It's been, if I think back over things that have happened here the last 20 years, this is definitely in the top 3.
Well, we were overjoyed to see this thing saved and hung, and again, I have to do a shout out. This is just a phenomenal, wonderful museum. If, again, whoever's out there watching, come up and see this place. The Washington Street exhibit is so cool.
What you've done in the space you have is amazing.
Yeah,
Right,
it really is.
that is true.
Make it interactive and visually interesting. It's not.
And it has a traffic light.
Absolutely.
That's the reason to come right
And,
now.
and the Sinatra Lounge.
That's true.
You can
That's
listen
true.
to That's Life and
Yeah.
watch the lights.
Yep. Good. Anyway, thank you. We're going to get some pizza in a few minutes, so let's hang out.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh, thank you.